There is a point where someone doesn't fight you, doesn't argue with you, doesn't even hate you anymore. They simply stop emotionally existing with you. Not because they are weak, but because they finally understood something about you that changed everything. And the most shocking part is this: you usually don't notice it happening. Because what looks like love ending in chaos is often love ending in silence. And by the time you realize something is wrong, their mind has already rewritten your place in their emotional world. Have you ever felt like someone slowly became harder to reach, even though they were still physically there? They still replied, they still smiled, they still acted normal, but something inside the connection changed. And you couldn't explain what. That's because emotional withdrawal doesn't always announce itself. It builds quietly through repeated patterns until one day the bond no longer feels the same on their side. You didn't lose them in a fight. You lost them in a moment so small that you didn't even notice it happening. And that is exactly why it broke everything apart so deeply, because an empath does not break loudly or explode when they are hurt. Instead, they slowly fade away when something inside them finally becomes quiet. And that silence does not begin when they leave you. It starts much earlier, long before the ending, buried deep inside their mind, quietly collecting every contradiction they ignored, every moment they tried to excuse, every time they told themselves to understand you again. You think they are just emotional people who feel too much, but what you don't realize is how observant they really are. They are not only feeling everything, they are also recording everything. Every change in your tone, every half-truth you told, every moment your words did not match your behavior. Nothing is truly missed. It all stays there, even when they act like it didn't matter. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. While you were assuming they would always be there, always forgiving, always understanding you, they were slowly coming to a painful realization that you were not trying to understand them in the same way. But they don't confront it immediately. That is the first thing people misunderstand. Confrontation is loud, direct, and conscious. What an empath does is much quieter and far more complex. It happens inside their mind without warning. They begin to suppress not just their pain, but their expectations of you. And this is where things start to shift in a way you cannot easily see. Because the moment an empath stops expecting anything from you, they also stop depending on you emotionally. And that change does not come with drama or arguments or a final conversation. It happens silently, like something slowly switching off inside them. You will not notice it at first. There is no sudden breakup energy, no emotional explosion, no clear ending that tells you something is wrong. They will still talk to you, still smile, still respond to your messages, still show up in your life in ways that feel normal. But underneath all of that, something has already changed. Internally, they have started detaching. Their emotional presence is no longer fully connected to you, even if their physical presence still is. And most people completely miss this because they are used to visible reactions. They believe love only ends in conflict, in shouting, in breaking things apart loudly. But real emotional endings often don't look like that at all. In reality, love does not always die in chaos. More often, it dies in silence. A silence built slowly from unspoken disappointment, from moments where they chose not to say anything, from times they convinced themselves it was not worth the discussion. Over time, that silence grows heavier. It becomes a space filled with everything they felt but never expressed. And at some point, their subconscious reaches a conclusion that their conscious mind kept trying to avoid, a conclusion that quietly forms without permission or debate. You are no longer safe for me emotionally. And once that idea settles inside them, it does not argue with itself anymore. It does not ask for clarification. It does not try to fix itself. It simply becomes the new emotional truth they live by. From that point onward, everything they feel starts adjusting around that belief. Their reactions change, their emotional investment shifts, their connection to you becomes distant, even if nothing looks different on the surface. It is not a decision made in anger. It is a realization built from accumulation. And here is the part that makes it even harder to understand. An empath does not remove you from their life because they stopped caring. They remove you because continuing to care started to feel like a form of self-betrayal. The human mind, especially one that feels on a deep emotional level, can tolerate a great amount of pain. It can endure disappointment, confusion, and emotional imbalance for a long time. But there is one thing it cannot survive forever: self-betrayal. When a person keeps ignoring their own emotional truth just to keep someone else comfortable, something inside them starts to fracture slowly. It does not break immediately. Instead, the mind begins to split into two versions of reality. One part still remembers who you used to be, the version they once trusted, cared for, and believed in. The other part can only see what you have become through repeated experiences. And that conflict between memory and reality starts to create constant internal tension. At first, they try to understand it. They don't rush to blame you. Instead, they turn inward. They start asking themselves quiet questions they never say out loud. Why am I still here? Why am I accepting this kind of emotional experience? Why does something that used to feel safe now feel uncomfortable and wrong? These questions don't fade with time. They grow stronger. They repeat themselves in different situations, in different moods, until they slowly start shaping a conclusion that cannot be ignored anymore. It does not come as a sudden realization. It builds gradually until it becomes something their mind can no longer avoid or deny. And this is where the shift happens. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. There is no sudden confrontation or emotional explosion. It is permanent but silent. Because once the subconscious mind reaches a conclusion, the conscious mind has no choice but to follow it. And when an empath finally reaches that point of clarity, they do not simply walk away from you in the way people usually imagine. They do something more internal. They begin to erase the emotional version of you that once held meaning in their life. It is not physical departure first, it is emotional deletion. From that moment onward, you are not losing them suddenly, you are losing them in reverse. Everything starts to change in a way that feels confusing if you are not paying attention. Memories that once felt warm begin to lose emotional weight. Moments that once felt significant are reinterpreted through a new lens. Even the connection you thought was strong begins to slowly dismantle itself inside their perception. And the most unsettling part is that you will not see it happening in real time. To you, things may still appear normal. Conversations still happen, smiles still exist, daily interactions still continue as if nothing has changed. But internally, something very different is taking place. While you were still assuming there is time, they are already starting to emotionally disconnect. You believe there is stability, but they are already processing distance. And by the time you notice something feels off, the shift has already completed itself long before you became aware of it. That is what makes it so difficult to reverse. It is not that they leave suddenly. It is that they leave gradually in a direction you cannot easily detect. At this stage, most people react emotionally. They try harder. They become more attentive, more kind, more available. They attempt to fix what they believe is still repairable. But the harsh truth is that they are not competing with another person. They are competing with a version of that empath who has already learned how to exist without them emotionally. That version is calm, stable, and no longer attached to the emotional highs and lows that once existed. It is not angry, it is not confused, it is simply detached and certain. Because once an empath reaches that state of internal clarity, they are no longer reacting to your actions. They are responding to their own emotional conclusion. And at that point, staying becomes more painful than leaving. It feels like moving backwards in their own growth. And the human mind, once it has evolved past something, rarely chooses to return to what it has already outgrown. So they do not argue, they do not fight, they do not express hatred, they simply disconnect. And that is what makes it unsettling. They don't feel anger toward you, they don't even feel the need to explain themselves anymore. Instead, they reach a state where there's nothing left to feel in the same way. And when an empath reaches emotional neutrality toward you, something irreversible happens. You are no longer part of their emotional world. You are no longer someone they are internally connected to. You simply exist outside of their emotional reality. And that brings up a question most people never fully answer for themselves. What exactly happened that caused someone who once felt everything so deeply for you to eventually feel nothing at all? The answer is not found in a single moment. It is not a dramatic event that caused the collapse. It is a pattern that formed over time, a slow repetition of emotional experiences where their depth was not met, where their sensitivity was overlooked, where their understanding was taken for granted. Over time, those repeated experiences train the subconscious mind. They teach it what to expect and what not to expect. And once that lesson is fully absorbed, it becomes permanent. It cannot simply be erased by sudden change or temporary effort. Because at that point, the empath is no longer reacting emotionally to isolated moments. They are responding to a pattern they have already decoded. And this is where it becomes even more complex. An empath does not just feel pain. They analyze it. They revisit moments not to stay stuck in suffering, but to understand the deeper structure behind them. They look at what was said, what was done, and more importantly, what it revealed about the underlying truth of the relationship. And once they begin to see patterns, they cannot unsee them. At that stage, the relationship is no longer just emotional, it becomes psychological. Because what they once experienced through feeling is now processed through understanding. And understanding, once it replaces emotional attachment, changes everything permanently. The inconsistency, the emotional shortcuts, and the subtle dismissals that were disguised as normal behavior all start forming a pattern in an empath's mind. At first, they try not to overthink it. They give space for mistakes, for misunderstandings, for human flaws. But over time, patterns stop feeling accidental. They start feeling intentional. And once that shift happens, you are no longer seen as mysterious or complex. You become predictable. And predictability, especially when it is tied to repeated emotional disappointment, is one of the fastest ways to weaken emotional attachment. But here is something most people fail to understand. The empath is not really detaching from you in the way it appears. In many cases, they are simply returning to themselves. That emotional energy you once experienced from them, the patience, the understanding, the depth, was never something you permanently owned. It was something they were offering from within themselves. And once they begin to recognize imbalance, they slowly start reclaiming that energy, piece by piece, emotion by emotion, until there is nothing left to give in the same way anymore. And this is where people usually make their final mistake. They try to reach the old version of the empath. They bring up shared memories. They remind them of good times. They attempt to restart what once existed emotionally. But what they don't realize is that the past no longer holds the same emotional meaning for the empath. It does not feel comforting anymore. It feels misleading. Because now, through clarity, they can see things they were not able to see before. And once perception changes, emotional attachment does not stay the same. When awareness replaces illusion, attachment begins to collapse naturally. And at that point, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse anything. Because the empath does not simply move on in the emotional sense. They go through an internal rewiring. Their emotional standards change. What they tolerate reduces. What they accept narrows. Their emotional access to others becomes more selective, not out of bitterness or anger, but out of understanding. And clarity, once fully formed, does not bend easily. It does not care about history or shared time. It only responds to truth as it now sees it. And this is the part that often feels most difficult to accept. When an empath reaches the stage of emotional separation, they do not miss you in the way you assume they would. They are not constantly replaying memories with longing. They are not sitting in emotional confusion or regret. Instead, they begin to see things differently. What once felt meaningful may now feel like something they simply outgrew, not because it was meaningless, but because their understanding of it has changed. And this is where your experience starts to shift into something more painful. You do feel the absence. You do notice the silence. You do sense that something important is no longer accessible, but you cannot reach it anymore. That creates a very specific kind of emotional pain. It is not just loss, it is disconnection. It is the feeling of being emotionally locked out of someone's inner world. You were not just left behind, you were removed from access. And no amount of effort can force your way back into that space. Because emotional access to an empath is not maintained through persistence or pressure. It is maintained through alignment. And once that alignment breaks, the connection no longer functions in the same way. You are no longer interacting with the same emotional structure you once had. So they do not feel the need to block you. They do not feel the need to argue. They do not feel the need to explain every detail of their decision. Because explanations are usually needed when someone is still emotionally engaged in the outcome. But in this state, they are no longer operating from that place. They have already done the internal processing. They have already made sense of what happened. They have already reached acceptance. So when they finally step away externally, it may feel sudden to you, but internally, it is already complete. And this leads to a realization that is often difficult to sit with. You did not truly lose them the moment they walked away. You lost them much earlier, at the point where they no longer felt emotionally safe staying in the same way they used to. Everything that followed after that was just the visible outcome of a decision that had already been made internally long before you noticed it. And at that stage, what remains is something you cannot easily repair. Because the version of them that once felt connected to you no longer exists in the same emotional form. Not because they vanished, but because they evolved beyond the version of the dynamic that could no longer support who they were becoming. And that is the part most people are never prepared for. When an empath leaves your emotional world, they do not just leave the relationship. They leave the emotional version of the story that once included you in the same way. When someone feels deeply, their attachment is not built only on attraction or shared moments. It is built on interpretation. They are constantly trying to understand meaning behind behavior, tone, timing, silence, and emotional effort. So when inconsistency keeps repeating, it does not just create confusion, it creates internal recalibration. They start adjusting how they see you, not based on what you say, but based on what repeatedly happens. Over time, this shift is so gradual that the other person rarely notices it forming. At the beginning, they will still give benefit of doubt. They will still try to explain things in your favor. They will still assume good intention, even when behavior does not fully support it. But emotional intelligence does not stay passive forever. It keeps collecting data. And when enough emotional contradictions stack up, the mind stops treating them as isolated events. It starts treating them as a pattern. That is the moment where perception begins to change quietly. Once that happens, their emotional responses start losing intensity, not because they stop caring suddenly, but because their nervous system is no longer interpreting situations the same way. What once felt meaningful now feels slightly uncertain. What once felt safe now feels slightly unstable. And when emotional safety becomes questionable for long enough, the mind begins to reduce attachment naturally. It is not a decision, it is a protective adjustment. During this phase, most people misunderstand what is happening. They still see the same person smiling, responding, engaging, and assume everything is fine. But internally, the emotional investment is already changing direction. The empath does not always express this shift outwardly because they are often trying to make sense of it themselves first. They spend more time observing, analyzing, and questioning their own emotional state than confronting the other person directly. That is why withdrawal often feels sudden from the outside. In reality, it has been happening slowly in the background for a long time. By the time it becomes visible, a large part of the emotional detachment is already complete. What you are seeing is not the beginning of the end, it is the end becoming visible. One of the most difficult parts to understand is that empathy does not mean unlimited tolerance. In fact, people who feel deeply often have lower tolerance for repeated emotional mismatch, not because they are harsh, but because they are aware. They notice small shifts that others might ignore, and when those small shifts consistently point in the same direction, their mind forms conclusions earlier than expected. At some point, they stop trying to fix the dynamic in the same way, not because they want to punish, but because effort starts feeling emotionally inefficient. They begin to invest their energy inward again. Their attention shifts back to themselves, their stability, and their emotional balance. This is where detachment becomes real, not as a reaction, but as a recentering. From the outside, this can look like sudden coldness, but internally it feels like relief mixed with clarity. The emotional confusion reduces, the mental noise becomes quieter, and once that clarity settles, reversing it becomes very difficult because they are no longer making decisions based on emotional uncertainty. They are making decisions based on emotional understanding. What makes this dynamic even more complex is that the other person often realizes the loss only when access is already reduced. They try to reconnect at the exact moment the internal emotional door has already started closing. So even genuine effort feels ineffective, not because it is wrong, but because it is late in the process. And when that realization fully settles, it creates a very specific kind of emotional gap. Not just loss of a person, but loss of emotional influence. The connection does not feel active anymore. It feels archived, present in memory, but no longer alive in the same psychological space. At that stage, the empath is not holding resentment. They are not replaying anger. They are simply no longer emotionally oriented toward the same bond. The connection has been reclassified in their mind as something that no longer defines their present emotional reality. In the end, this is not about someone becoming cold or heartless. It is about the natural way the human mind protects its own emotional balance when something keeps feeling inconsistent or unsafe over time. Deep feelers don't disconnect quickly. They understand, they observe, they give chances, and they try to hold things together far longer than they should sometimes. But when clarity finally forms inside them, it becomes stronger than attachment. What looks sudden from the outside is usually the result of a long internal process, a process where feelings were analyzed, patterns were noticed, and emotional truth slowly became clearer than emotional hope. And once that clarity settles, the connection doesn't disappear out of anger, it simply stops feeling aligned with who they are anymore. At that point, they don't need to explain every detail or justify every change, not because your presence meant nothing, but because their inner world has already moved past the confusion. What remains is acceptance, not conflict, distance, not drama, silence, not resentment. And for the other person, the real understanding comes later, not in trying to go back, but in recognizing that emotional connections survive through mutual awareness, consistency, and care on both sides. When that balance changes, the relationship naturally changes with it. In the end, people don't just lose each other in moments. They drift apart through small shifts that build over time until only clarity remains where closeness used to be.